All right, a quick video to explain a question I had. So removing objects from lists. So I'm not sure exactly the details of the question, but how I would go about removing objects from lists, and then let's say excluding them and then acting on them. There's a node that exists inside of the objects category called remove object from list. So what it does is, let's say you already have a list. You can create one manually, and there's a few other ways that you can kind of get lists. I think the bounds would work if they were actually functional. I don't think they are in the current build. But what you do is to remove something from a list, you have a list here of 4 items, and then you feed it into the object from list. So I guess it'd be better to follow actually the code flow to understand this a little better. So on the game start, so this is how it's going to execute. So when the game starts, it's going to follow this line down, and it's going to go for each object. Well, it's like what it's going to do is it's going to follow back and collect the objects. And what it's going to do is this whole chain over here of stuff is going to get resolved before it does anything else. So what it's going to do is it's going to try to remove objects from the list. It's like, hey, we need to get we need to go follow it back to get the list, and then this list needs to follow it back and grab all of these items. So at this point right here where the object list is, there are 4 items. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then, so once this is created, the remove object receives it, and it kind of steps back up into the remove object list, and then it removes an item or an object that you feed in, which we're feeding in one of the items that we added to the original list, because you can't remove something that's not in the list already. So we're just going to use the number 1 item, which is a Forerunner ring full. So which is this item here. So all of these are in the list. All of these items are in the list. So how I have it set up is that we're going to remove an item from a list, and then once this is gathered all the item and removed it, it's going to return a new list. As you can see, it says new object list here. So now that we have the object in the list that no longer has an object in it, it's going to go for each object. So for each object in that list that no longer has this object, the number 1 object in it, we're going to execute per object. So this node will get called 4 times because there are 4 objects on our list. So think of it, it's like a loop. So basically, it's like, hey, for each item in the list, so it's like, hey, we're at item... See, it says you can actually check that number here. I don't know if it's base 0 or 1. I think this game it bases off 1. So it's going to start up, and the counter is going to be 1, and then it's going to count down. It's going to loop down through and do something to the first item in the list. So it would do something to whatever the item is at the top of the list. And in this case, it'd be this primitive block, and it would do it first, and then it would loop back down and do it for the next one. So it would loop over. This would turn to a 2, loop back over to 3. For this for each loop, that's maybe a really bad explanation of the for each loop. But basically, for each time it loops back, you can execute per object. So for every object, you can call something. It's a little misleading because these little diamonds here, hopefully they change this when it comes out. Normally in this, the little diamonds mean code flow. Because if you look here, there's diamonds here, there's a diamond here. And the little circles mean like data transfer. So it's like it's passing something in. It's like it's a parameter. But for some reason on this execute per in this current object, they're dots. Annoying. They should be small triangles. But it's annoying. So execute per object. So that means for every object in the list, this set object position is going to be called. And they're also feeding in the current object. So for every object, we're going to feed it an object as well, because it also puts out it executes per object and gives us the object. And then down here, we're just creating a random vector 3 between 0 and 1,000 and feeding it into the position for each object. So if this is set up right, you would expect, because object 1 up here, this object here, the Forerunner ring full, is no longer in the list by this point right here, by the removed objects from list, it won't be affected by the set object position. And we can see that if we hit F6. If we walk over here, you see there are no cubes, but this is still here. So if I go back into it, you see those 3 cubes pop back up and this one doesn't move. If I do it again just to show, those 3 move, it doesn't. I hope that answered your question. There's a few other ways to do this that are a little bugged right now. You can set up, if you wanted a bit more control over objects, object variables and creating object lists, you can create in the variables advanced, you can declare a object list variable. And you can declare an object list variable, but currently the identifier object, which is also in the basic variables, this identifier, it's currently bugged in this build, and it doesn't actually save the name of the identifier. It works. Like, you can name it. It says it here, but when you swap tabs, it doesn't work. You can make this work for, I think, 1 object per graph. I haven't done too much testing on it, but you can do some experimenting with declaring an object, and then you can get this object. So if you go to Variables Advanced, get object list, and then feed in the same named identifier. It doesn't have to be this exact node. It can be another node with the same variable in it. So up here it says value, like, let's say I named this like object list. Object list list 1. Or object list 1 and confirmed it. If we were in the actual proper build of Forge instead of this kind of like weird hacked version, you know, like this would work. But right now the value names don't save. But what you can do with this is you can get this list, do normal operations on it like we did with this list down here, like removing it from a list. And then we can also set this list back. There's another variable said set object variable. Not object variable, object list. Set object list variable. So then you can pass in more objects. I wonder if this adds. Set object list variable. See, we need to do some testing. I assume, I'm not exactly sure how you would fill this in. So I assume you could. So okay, so it's misnamed. It says value here. I assume value is the object list. I haven't done too much experimenting with object lists with the advanced variables, like actually declaring your own, because they're currently bugged with the identifier. But hopefully that answered your question. It shouldn't be. Hopefully it won't be too hard to solve your own issue with what I've given you here.